Good morning, everybody. Welcome to MiraCosta's continuing education program, our very first Black History event. We're very happy to have you join us, and I'm very happy to introduce Mr. Marcus Williams to you. He's going to be our presenter. And just before he takes over, I just want to inform you about a few things. First, I think we're all familiar with Zoom by now. If you've got a question, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A section, and you can just click there, write your questions, and at the end of the presentation, we will share the questions with Mr. Williams, and he will address them. If you want to put something in the chat box, you can just click on chat, and whatever you write there will be going out to the panelists and all of the other participants as well. So I will just hand over to Mr. Williams now, and he will introduce himself and get started with the presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me first say that I am honored to been asked to bring forth this, it seems to be inaugural Black History event. I have a passion for this, and as you notice, I am Black. Being an educator, I believe that Black history is American history. So with that said, our title is A Legacy of Rising Above Suppression. First slide, second slide. I'm going to jump right in and say it is my express hope and desire to bring you a further illumination of the Black American experience within this country, known as the United States, and this month recognized as being Black History Month. Continue. In most Black history presentations, the accomplishments and contributions of Blacks are brought forth to give evidence why and how our ethnic group is deserving to partake in the American dream, which is rooted in the Constitution and sundry laws of the land. But today, I have chosen to offer you a different perspective as to why the aforementioned path of qualifying to be full participants in the American dream has been in many cases thwarted, denied, and even crushed, causing the attainment of that dream to be so difficult. To speak plainly, Black history in the United States was made to be difficult by design, even before 13 callings were firmly established, before there was a United States of America. First, let us review some definitions that will help us have a clearer understanding of some of the processes that will help you connect some of the historical dots. Suppression, to put down by authority or force. Indentured, forced to work by contract. Continue. Slavery, a condition in which one human being is owned by another, an existence created by law, that a human being is property or chattel, and is deprived of most of the rights held by free persons. And this part is most important because what slavery is, was, and continues to be to this day, if you think about child labor laws and forced prostitution, it is an economic business model where human beings are foundational in producing revenue for the sole enrichment of the enslaver. neo-slavery, a public-private system that undid freedoms that came with Reconstruction for most of the 30 years after the Civil War. Jim Crow, laws passed by state and local governments that legalized racial segregation to deny equal opportunities to Blacks and non-white people. And let me just stop here and pause. There is evidence that we live in a new Jim Crow era in this country. And I just need to put this pin in here that is evidenced by the high incarceration rate of African Americans, of Blacks in the United States. It is the highest in the entire world. And the ability to pass laws for drugs or whatever have negatively impacted the African American community, where now many academics are suggesting that the neo or new Jim Crow is really with us. Next definition, miscegenation, marriage, cohabitation, or sexual intercourse between a white person and a member of another race. Let me again put a pin here. Miscegenation really means marrying or having these relationships outside of your own. But for the purposes of this discussion, the narrow focus is between a white person and a member of any other non-white culture or person. Continue. Okay, a brief history. And I have to tell you something. I was, when I was doing my research, some of this surprised me also. But just know that people of African descent were here long before slavery really was instituted. But Black freemen and indentured Black men and Black slaves were part of the Virginia colony, which started in 1607, and the province of Maryland, which started at 1632, from the inception of these colonies. The aging King Charles I sent as many British men and women as would go to the New World, because there was an immense population explosion that was a serious drain on the country. Let me stop. I'm trying to have you follow a thread of economics also through this presentation. Right now in our country, we are having a discussion, a debate of how much money to give people who are suffering from this, the effects of the pandemic. King Charles had the same problem, that people were on the public dole and it was draining the treasury. And so he had to find a way to eliminate or that drain off the population. Continue. The colonists paid money to the crown for the passage of the indentured service, which included African descended Blacks and some courageous women. And let me say here, I found out that there were plenty of African descended sailors in England at this time. The indenturement lasted between 7 and 14 years. And again, yes, there were Black slaves among these groups. Previously, land grants had been given to provincial governors and wealthy merchants and elite who sought to enlarge their fortunes. In today's jargon, these elites were truly the 1%. I mean, literally the 1%. Continue. This is a picture of the first real cash crop in Virginia and in Maryland, especially Virginia. And it was not cotton, it was tobacco. Continue. So these landowners were able to cash in on their bets because the very lucrative cash crop of tobacco was found earlier by Sir Walter Raleigh and brought back to England in 1586. As you well know, the Native Americans knew about tobacco, and they were smoking pipes way back when, but the tobacco in America was rich. It was aromatic. It was satisfying. I will tell you something. This is off the track. My great grandmother partook in tobacco, and tobacco has a tendency to be sweet, and so she would put it in her tongue and her jaw, and it was called snuff. And she would put that, and it would serve the purpose of satisfying her taste buds. And that's where you get the movie with the spittoons, and that is because of the sweetness, the richness of tobacco. But tobacco, you need to produce a high grade, it needs lots of land, and it needs lots of hands. It needed laborers. So, free indentured servants and freed slaves did enjoy equal opportunities to better their lives. This is really important because what you had was the rich and the poor. That was it. The colonists that were there were mostly British men, and so therefore believe it or not, the Native Americans, the African descendants, and the British men were on the same level. So much so that they intermarried, that they had their own communities. And so there was no differentiation in class except for the landowners and basically the workers. Now, again, most indentured servants were British men who rarely owned land, rarely. This is interesting for the ladies who are in the audience. The ratio of men to women was approximately 10-1. So it wasn't very difficult for a woman to find a husband if that's what she wanted. At one point in the District of Maryland, in one of the districts, it's been recorded that half the marriages of men of African descent were to British women. Continue. Indentured servants would work long hours for little pay with little hope to buy land of their own. Life in the colonies was hard. Deadly skirmishes with the local displaced Native American Indian tribes was also a never-ending concern. Continue. It is at this point that the die would be cast that colored the fate and uphill fight leading to Black suppression. It is known as Bacon's Rebellion. Okay. Both Virginia and Maryland were still ruled by the British Crown, and taxes were high. As indentured servants began to get their freedom, the service began to dwindle, and the landowners used unscrupulous methods to retain labor. let's go back to this definition of miscegenation. If a woman of European descent were to marry and this is some of the laws that came later, a man of African descent, she would lose her freedom. She would become a slave. If they had any children, the children would be slaves until 20 years old. Let us continue. So, no, go back. Very good. Nathaniel Bacon was a rich, disgruntled landowner, and Sir William Berkeley, governor of Virginia, vehemently disagreed over the priorities of governance within the colony. Now you may go. Bacon wanted to fight the Native American Indian tribes because they were attacking the colonist settlements. Berkeley was afraid that retaliating would start an expensive war between the Native American Indian tribes and the colonists. Before we go on here, it has been suggested that Berkeley also did not want to fight the Native American folks because he feared two things. Number one, that they would all get together and overrun the colony. And the other was that he had a side business with many of the Native Americans in the fur trade. So they would bring him furs and he would, under the table, under the nose of the crown, he would sell this for profit. Continue. So here's what Bacon did. Bacon gathered a group of, I should have said Europeans, indentured servants, and slaves. And he promised the slaves their freedom if they won. Let me stop here and say what he did. So this lasted 1 year. And what he did was he attacked the wrong Native American tribe and wiped them out. And so it was like the tribe that he should have wiped out, or should have been fighting, continued to harass the colonists. But he was successful with his militia. And so Berkeley, being afraid, as I said before, of what might happen, Berkeley raised his militia to fight Bacon. Now, this word militia appears over and over again in American history. And I'm going to say to you that the way that it's been used, most people really don't understand, and the effect of the militias. And I will digress here and say that the Constitution, the Second Amendment to the Constitution reads something like a well-regulated militia being necessary to secure the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so these militias, instead of protecting the colonists against the Native Americans, morphed into militias that were used as slave catchers. And that was a way that you will see in the future also produced this economy. Finally, Bacon and his groups were once more successful. And the next year, they burned Jamestown to the ground. And so this militia was quite formidable. These Europeans, men, these indentured black servants, these black slaves literally won. Next slide. Bacon was wounded and died, and his group fell apart. And Berkeley ended up hanging several of the Bacon militia. But what happened was this. Many people believe that the fear of Bacon's group that was made up of different racial groups caused the land-holding elite to stop using indentured servants and rely heavily on black slaves. Next slide. So several lessons were learned from Bacon's rebellion. A united labor force equaled trouble. Virginia's lawmakers decided to adopt a divide and conquer form of governing. White people suddenly became a phenomenon. Laws were passed that said that people of African descent were to be hereditary slaves. Now, don't go on yet. What we're seeing here is something where whites now have come into existence. There was no such thing as a white person on the planet before 1681. Not biologically, not culturally, not racially. It is a made-up construct that allowed rich landowners to separate people with common interest from one another based upon not religion, which was in the past, but now on melanin or lack of melanin in one's skin. Continue. So, anti-miscegenation laws were passed. Marriage between a white person and a non-white person was prohibited and punishable, as I explained before. Let me also say this. I was going to show you a picture of my great-grandmother, who both my great-grandmothers had high cheekbones. I know for a fact that my family married into the Blackfeet Indian tribe. But they weren't put down because of that, because it was, if blacks and Native Americans got together, that was fine. If, in the period of the Chinese came to America, if Chinese and a Native American married or black, that was fine. But these anti-miscegenation laws were designed to keep white women away from other groups and to basically keep them in check and a larger supply for the European men. And these laws lasted for more than 300 years, from 1664 to 1967, when it was ruled unconstitutional in the famous case of Loving versus the state of Virginia case. Continue. Here's what started to happen with the divide and conquer. Freed blacks could not hold political office. Whites were required to be paid in goods, including guns and gunpowder. Free blacks could not own weapons. Blacks could not testify against whites. Let me go to the top here. First of all, blacks not holding political office. And this is important because if you are denied your input to a system, whether it's good or bad, then you are, for all practical purposes, you are, whatever comes out of that system, you have to live with. You are a victim of that. The whites were required to be paid in goods, including guns and gunpowder. As you remember, there was no real currency in the early stages of America. There was no standardized currency. And so, gold and silver, of course, have always been used, but it was a barter system where you could actually barter and be paid in goods, food, as it were, including guns and gunpowder. And this is important because blacks couldn't own weapons. And so therefore they were at the mercy of whites who had the guns and the powder. Indeed, a freed black could not even defend his home. So this was again, furthering of this divide and conquer, and it might have been better to put divide and suppress. And the blacks could not testify against whites. This is unconscionable that in our jurisprudence system, that if a black person had the truth, that they were unable to say that truth in open court. There is a famous case that happened in 1955. Many of you probably don't remember the Emmett Till case, where a young black man went south in the Mississippi, and an altercation happened, which is still fuzzy today. Supposedly he insulted a white woman, and he was abducted and tortured and killed, and his body was thrown into the river. And someone witnessed it, and it was a black man by the name of Mobley Wright. And this was the first time in the South that a black man came forward, and he uttered these words that would change jurisprudence in the South forever. They asked him, "Do you see the man that kidnapped Emmett Till?" And in his broken English, which you would probably call Ebonics today, he said, "Dar he," meaning there he is. And that was the first time. And that testimony broke the moral, social fear of blacks testifying against whites in open court. And by the way, he was, after he testified, he was escorted by federal agents to Chicago, where they changed his name and he lived out his life. Next slide. In spite of these oppressive practices in the South, many blacks rose up and made their way to the North and freedom. Continue. Okay, Henry Box Brown and Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is the most well-known, being a slave. And I believe he escaped to Delaware, and there he educated himself, and he became quite the orator. Henry Box Brown mailed himself to freedom with the help of the abolitionists. Continue. So Robert Smalls, I read in one of the black newspapers that he was considered to be the first gangster. And the reason was that he had been trained to be a steamboat pilot. And so what he did was, during the war, he stole a steamboat with all his cargo and some of his fellow slaves and turned it over to Union forces. He later became a he established actually the Republican Party in, I believe it was South Carolina. No, it was North Carolina. And he went on to represent them in the legislature. And Harriet Jenkins became a writer, but she's most noted for outwitting her white owner who was trying to have relationships with her, and she found ways to hide and to thwart him off. Next. William and Ellen Craft. Most ingenious way of resisting this suppression. They were in love, and they knew that if they were caught, that he would be hung and she would be enslaved. And so they concocted a wonderful plan. She took all the money that they had, and she dressed as a man, and who was disabled, bad arm, and all. And they booked a train to Canada, where they escaped from the South together, and they lived out their days together. Continue. Okay. A civil war broke the capitalist model of slavery, but not the model of white control and white privilege was not to be surrendered. A brief period of self-determination, referred to as the Reconstruction period, lasted from 1865 to 1877, and it allowed Blacks and some poor whites to be elected to local, state, and even congressional houses of government. This is important because it was there that this era of freedom, this reset, was possible for African Americans, for Blacks in this country. But unfortunately, a racist president, Andrew Johnson, started the wheel moving to remove the Union troops out of the South. As long as the Union troops were there, the Blacks could vote, they had their businesses, they had their lives, they were protected by the law. But as the Union soldiers were withdrawn, we had a rise of a backlash, and basically called white backlash. And the only really true success that come out of the Reconstruction period were the passages of the 14th and 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, granting citizenship to Blacks and granting them the right to vote. Next. These are some of the men that during that period of time represented various states in Congress, in the U.S. Congress. Just give you a moment to look at that, to see that these were educated men, these were men who were leaders in their communities. Next. The final phase of that links Bacon's rebellion to Black history today is that of the Jim Crow laws. Duly elected local governments were often overturned and officials run out of town or murdered as Northern Union soldiers were withdrawn from the South. One of the most famous stories happened in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, where a successful coalition of Black and white Republican lawmakers were deposed by racists. They were just actually run out of town. Continue. The most famous event or infamous event in Black history is the burning and killing of residents in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. My research has shown me that Tulsa, Oklahoma was not the only one. Black townships and communities were destroyed as far away as New York, and disenfranchised as far as California. To my count, this happened some 25 times, where successful communities were sat upon by racists. In this particular case, Black Wall Street, they had this enormous amount of wealth. The next slide will show you this, but this enormous amount of wealth, where the dollar turned over, 8 or 9 times within their own community. And this happened because, so that you will know, supposedly the story is that a young Black man went to the white side of town and the elevators were manually operated, generally by men and by women. A white woman was in the elevator, and the elevator came to a bump, a really large bump, and the young Black man bumped by accident this young white girl, and she hollered out, "Oh!" And some white man passing by basically said, did he harm you? Did he try to do something to you? And before any explanation could be given, the rumors spread by wildfire, that a young Black man had tried to molest, to rape a white woman in the white town. And so what happened after that was carnage. It was a massacre. And even firebombs were dropped from airplanes onto the buildings in the township, and hundreds of people were murdered. And I recall there was a leading doctor, his last name was Williams, is why I remember, and they walked into his office and just murdered him while he was with his patients and his patients. This was not acknowledged in Oklahoma's history records until 1996. Next slide. Next slide. So, 600 businesses were destroyed, 21 churches, 21 restaurants, 3 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, 6 private planes, 1 hospital, 1 bank, and of course, the entire school system was decimated. Continue. Okay, so in Jim Crow, the Southern states returned to the verbiage and tactics of the post-Bacon Rebellion because slavery was illegal. So what they devised is this supposed separate but equal doctrine, Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, to this day, which still decimated the Black economic growth, resulting in separate hospitals, separate schools that were never equal, and then the greatest builder of wealth, which is housing. Continue. Next slide. This is just a picture of what that looked like. And again, I have a story. I was told I had 40 minutes, so I'm going to make this story really quick. As a child, I was driving, my mother had taken me to Boston, and it was a segregated train. And there was one side for whites and one side for Blacks. And being a city boy, I had never seen cows, and I had never seen horses. And so I went to the white side of the train, my mother tells me. And I said, Mom, look, horses and cows. And my mother was afraid. And she said, young boy, get back over here. And the white conductor said, leave him alone. He's just fine. And so I say all that to say that, you know, social attitudes really began to change in the 50s and the 60s. The civil rights movement helped move that forward. But I assure you that the Jim Crow laws were very, very real and very, very suppressing to the Black community. Continue. Common sight. Common sight. Continue. So the Ku Klux Klan were called the Night Riders. Please notice what it says. It says, wake up, white America. And if you look at the flag to the right, it is the flag of the Confederacy. And people are claiming that this flag is just a throwback to a different time. But I put out to you, I say that the Confederate flag was and continues to be a symbol of white privilege and mostly white power. And any other interpretation for an African American is very hard to ascertain, to believe. My story, and I'm watching my time, is that in my own family history, the Ku Klux Klan ran my family off their land. They were in Alabama, in Goodwater, Alabama. And my great-grandparents owned a small pulp lumberyard or lumbering business. And as you know, pulp wood, the middle of it is very soft. And so it's used for paper. They had their own farm, they had their hogs, and they had their cows, and they had their orchards. And there were 6 children in the Bryant family. And what happened was one night, the Night Riders, as my Aunt Zelma would tell the story, came with their torches and they literally burned them out. And she would, as she would retell the story, she would have tears welling up in her eyes because the humiliation that she felt that they had to escape through their peanut orchard and their orchards in their, she called their night clothing, their pajamas. And so the suppression of African Americans, of Blacks, very real. Recently, I heard a person in past administration claim that Blacks aren't successful because we need to want to be successful, as though we have not wanted that since the inception of these 13 colonies. And the Ku Klux Klan has truly been one of the tools used to thwart that desire to progress in these United States. Next slide. Ms. Paula Murray, she was one of the first women to become a reverend in the Episcopalian Church, but she was an inspiration to, believe it or not, Ruth Ginsburg and to Eleanor Roosevelt. Continue. Mamie Till Mobley was the mother of Emmett Tills. And what she did was very brave. She wanted the world to see how they had mutilated her poor child. And she had an open casket showing this horrendous beating that this young man took. And most historians agree that his death and the trial was the beginning of the modern day civil rights movement. Continue. Claudette Colvin. A great writer, but she did something which she's not noted for, and that is Rosa Parks gets the credit for not leaving her seat on the bus. Claudette Colvin did that when she was 15 years old, well before Rosa Parks, and that's really her claim to fame. Next. Coretta Scott King, truly the wind beneath the wings of Martin Luther King Jr., but very much a activist in her own right. And little history that I will tell you, I am a member of Friendship Pasadena, known as Friendship Baptist Church. We have on our wall Coretta Scott King, because she would go around to various churches and she would give singing concerts to raise money for the cause. And we have a picture of her on our wall of honor, showing her in full regalia singing a song. Continue. Okay, we're coming down to the end now, and I asked you to just hang with me a little bit longer. Housing suppression. Nowhere as damaging as the suppression of blacks in the history of the United States is that of equal housing. In his book, The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein states the number one source of intergenerational wealth is still homeownership. From 1930 well into 1960, the federal government enacted policies to actively encourage white families to own homes while discouraging black families. Continue. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration created a system to determine which neighborhoods were deemed too risky to loan money to, and were redlined, meaning banks not to invest in them. Even before I start that. So blacks living in their own neighborhoods were redlined. They could not get monies to buy homes or to fix up their homes. After World War II, new suburban housing sprung up all over America, but for whites only. So blacks couldn't move into white neighborhoods and couldn't get loans in their own neighborhoods. Separate but equal, no. Until 1950, the National Realtors Code of Ethics, their reasoning was incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. Divide and conquer? Continue. Finally, the GI Bill, which really stands for a government issue, general issue, has been recognized by most economists to be one of the greatest enhancers for the white middle class. Here's an example of how it was distributed in New York and in New Jersey and Mississippi after World War II. 67,000 new mortgages were given to returning soldiers. Less than 100 were given to non-white soldiers. In Mississippi in 1947, 3,200 mortgages were given out and only 2 went to blacks. Therefore, whites were able to build wealth, meaning the equity in their homes. As time went by, I mean that their home became much more valuable. So they were able to invest in businesses by taking out that equity by loan, and have a retirement nest egg, pass on an inheritance to their children to go buy bigger homes or go into businesses, or even provide college funds for their children. Wealth suppression and economic control. Next. The legacy of suppression started by capitalist elite is well documented. My sincere hope is that this research changes the narrative on how and why Black history evolved as it has in America. This next statement is really why I did this. Self-serving statements from whites, how their ancestors made it in America, truly ring hollow when the facts of Blacks in America are known. Oh, my father came over after the war and he built a business, and my father came over and he had a restaurant, or, you know, we went to college. But those things were denied, by and large, to African Americans for a long, long time. And that's why the civil rights movement was so very necessary. Finally, Blacks have come to realize that education is the true key to self-determination. Unfortunately, social attitudes and public policies are also needed to help Blacks and other socially economic challenged groups to be successful and truly enjoy all that the Constitution and America has promised. Next. In spite of the institutionalized suppression, Black people in the United States have risen above their circumstances and continue to rise. Maya Angelou's poem, "And Still I Rise," demonstrates the buoyant spirit of the Black person and of the Black community. And I thank you.
You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Just because I walk as if I have oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, till I rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my sassiness upset you? Don't take it so hard just because I laugh, as if I have gold mines digging in my own backyard. You can shoot me with your words, you can cut me with your lies, you can kill me with your hatefulness, but just like life, I rise. Does my sexiness offend you? Oh. Does it come as a surprise that I dance? As if I have diamonds at the meeting of my thighs. Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain, I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling and bearing in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave and sister. Wow. There I go.
Truly, more ground still to travel.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Williams. This was very, very good, very informative, and we really appreciate it. We have a few minutes for a few questions. There is one question that was written in by a student, and she was asking if this is real. Is this real history?
This is real history. And I'm going to give you some names that you can look up yourself. If you look up an author, she is an academic. Her name is Jacqueline Battlora, Battlora, and she does a much better job with graphs that shows you from the 1600s on. And her book is called The Birth of a Nation, and I think the subtitle is The Invention of Whiteness. Another social activist by the name of Tim Wise has done extensive work on this. And my most favorite, which you can go to YouTube, is Jane Elliott. She has been doing this for, gosh, I don't want to say at least 40, 50 years out of Chicago. And she has documented everything that I've said. And so my research is not original. Let me say that. It's just something which grabbed me as an African American to learn more about. But these people, who are, by the way, white, have done extensive research. So yes, this is very, very real, very real.
All right. Are there any other questions or any comments that anyone would like to make? I see several messages of thank you in the chat box. Is there any comment, anyone, or any other question that a student or anyone else may have?
I have a comment.
All right.
I'd like to thank personally the Mary Costa College for their astute and great way they put this on, and especially Ms. Ruth Gay, who was my unofficial editor. And so I thank you all very much.